Welcome to our deep dive. We're tackling thinking fast and slow today. It's by Daniel Kahneman, and let me tell you, this book really gets you thinking about thinking.
It's true. It's really fascinating. This book explores how our minds work, but not in a typical way.
No, not at all.
No.
It dives into two systems of thinking.
System 1 and System 2.
Yeah.
System 1 is, well, it's fast, like really fast, intuitive, automatic. It's how we make those quick judgments and reactions.
And System 2, that's the slower one.
Right. It's more deliberate, takes effort.
That's the one we use for more complex things, problem solving, decisions that really need some thought.
And Kahneman uses these systems as a framework to, well, explain a lot, actually, like how we make judgments, decisions, and this is a big one, why we sometimes make decisions that just aren't rational, predictably irrational.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. One of the things I found super interesting were these things called heuristics.
Heuristics.
They're like mental shortcuts, right?
Yeah.
Our System 1, our fast thinking system, uses them to make those quick judgments.
Exactly. Like imagine you're walking down a dark street at night.
Okay, I'm picturing it. It's late, a little creepy, and I see a shadow that looks kind of like a person.
Right there, you just use the availability heuristic. Your mind jumps to threat because, well, you've heard about street crime, seen it on the news, so your System 1 kicks in and makes that judgment based on what's easily available in your memory.
So my mind goes to the worst case scenario because it's easier to recall those scary examples.
Pretty much. And that availability heuristic can be helpful sometimes, but it can also really lead us astray.
Makes sense. What about that anchoring effect? I remember that being a big one.
Oh yeah, anchoring is huge. Say you need to guess, I don't know, how many words are in a novel. You're more likely to be influenced by something totally irrelevant, like the length of the book's title or even the size of the font.
So my mind latches onto that first piece of information, even if it's totally random.
Exactly. And it throws off your whole estimate.
It's wild how our minds try to find the quickest, easiest answer, even if it's totally off.
It's all about that cognitive ease.
Cognitive ease.
It's this feeling of fluency, familiarity. Our minds tend to equate it with truth.
Things that are easy to process just feel more true.
More true, yeah. Even if they're not. It's like an illusion.
And it makes us more susceptible to, I don't know, believing things that are just not true.
Oh, absolutely. And this has huge implications, especially now, with social media and the constant flood of information. It's easy to get caught up in those quick headlines, the snappy sound bites.
So how do we fight that?
Engage that system too.
But that takes effort.
It does, but not as much as we think.
Yeah.
Even just a little bit of focus attention can make a difference.
It's like exercise, right? The more you do it, the easier it gets.
Exactly. And the rewards are huge. Better decisions, less manipulation. It's worth it.
Now let's talk about priming. This one blew my mind.
Priming, yeah, it's fascinating.
It's the idea that, well, imagine being exposed to one thing, like a word or an image. Later, you encounter something else, totally different, but your response is influenced by that first thing, the prime.
And you're not even aware of it. It's unconscious.
Kahneman describes this study where students were shown words related to, well, old age.
Like wrinkle, gray, Florida, that kind of thing.
Yeah, things like that. And afterwards, when they were timed walking down a hallway, guess what?
They walk slower.
Slower. It's like their minds subconsciously linked those words with slowness.
It's wild, isn't it? Just shows the power of our unconscious. We think we're in control, but
we're influenced by so much that we're not even aware of.
Exactly.
Okay, how about representativeness?
Representativeness. This one can lead us to some pretty bad judgments.
It's about stereotypes, right?
Yeah.
Like how well something fits our idea of what's typical.
Exactly. Kahneman uses this example of Tom W., a made-up person. He's described as being really into computers and math, not very social. So what do people assume he studies?
Computer science.
Right. But statistically, there are way more humanities majors than computer science majors.
So we go with the stereotype, even if it's statistically unlikely.
And we ignore the base rates, the overall probabilities.
We get so caught up in the specifics that we forget to look at the bigger picture.
And that can lead to all sorts of problems, especially when we're making big decisions.
Absolutely. Now, regression to the mean. This one always trips me up.
It's a tricky one for sure. It's basically like, think of extreme performances.
Okay, got it.
They tend to be followed by more average ones. It's just statistically how things work.
So if someone has a super amazing performance one time, the next time is likely to be closer to their average.
Exactly.
But we often misinterpret that, right? We look for a cause.
We do. Kahneman tells this story about a flight instructor who was convinced that praising a cadet for a good landing would make them worse the next time, and yelling after a bad landing would make them better.
So he saw a pattern that wasn't really there.
Exactly. He was mistaking regression to the mean for some kind of cause and effect.
That's so easy to do in everyday life.
Yeah.
We might think our success is because of some amazing skill or strategy.
When really it's partly just luck or random chance.
Or we blame ourselves for failures that were out of our control.
It's all about perspective and understanding how statistics work.
Okay, last one for now. The illusion of understanding.
Ah, yes. This is a biggie. We like to think we understand things.
We crave order, explanations.
But often those explanations are based on faulty assumptions. We create stories to make sense of the world even when they're not accurate.
That halo effect is a good example.
The halo effect.
Yeah, it's like if we think someone is attractive, we might assume they're also intelligent or kind.
It's like those first impressions. We form them so quickly, and then they're hard to shake even if they're wrong.
And it's not just about liking someone, it's also about disliking them.
Right. Oh, absolutely. If we already have a negative opinion of someone, we'll tend to interpret their actions in a negative light, even if they're doing something perfectly normal.
It's a reminder to, be aware of our biases and to seek out different perspectives.
Always a good idea.
Okay, so much to think about already.
Judgments. How do we even form them?
Right, it's not just about taking in information, is it? It's more than that.
Way more. Kahneman explained it as actively constructing meaning. We don't just passively observe.
And a lot of that's happening, on autopilot, right, without us even knowing.
Exactly. He uses this metaphor, it's kind of out there, the mental shotgun.
The mental shotgun, okay, that's vivid.
It is. It means our minds are constantly making these connections, these associations, even if we're trying to focus on just one thing.
So it's not a single thought, it's like a spray of thoughts.
Exactly. A shotgun blast, not a precisely aimed bullet. So say you're trying to, count vowels on a page. Your mind might also be thinking about what those words mean, what font they're in, what you're having for dinner later.
It's like our brains are multitasking, even when we don't want them to.
All the time. And it can be helpful, sometimes those connections spark creativity, but it can also make things unpredictable.
And then there's intensity matching.
Oh yeah, intensity matching. This one's interesting. It's how our brains try to translate values across different dimensions. Like, if Sam were as tall as he is intelligent, how tall would he be?
Okay, so you're taking something abstract, intelligence, and trying to map it onto something concrete, height, even though they're totally different things.
Exactly. Our brains do this all the time without us even realizing it. It's why first impressions can be so powerful. We might see someone who's well-dressed and instantly associate that with competence, even though those things have nothing to do with each other.
It's like our brains are always looking for those shortcuts, those easy answers, even if they're not accurate.
And that's how we end up with intuitive judgments about things we barely know anything about. We substitute easier questions for harder ones. Instead of analyzing all the information, we rely on gut feelings.
Which are often wrong, especially when it comes to things like investing or making big life decisions.
It's all about being aware of those shortcuts, those mental traps. Knowing they exist is the first step to avoiding them.
Okay, emotions. How do they play into all of this? Because we like to think we're making logical decisions, but
we're not always, are we? Emotions play a huge role. Kahneman talks about this thing called the affect heuristic.
The affect heuristic.
Basically, it means we make decisions based on how we feel. Instead of weighing the pros and cons, we just ask ourselves, do I like this? Do I hate this?
And that's it. That's how we decide.
More often than we realize. It can be efficient, in some cases, but it can also lead to some really bad choices. Like, imagine you're feeling super anxious about something.
Okay, feeling anxious.
You're way more likely to make an impulsive decision, even if it's not the best one in the long run. Or say you're feeling super optimistic.
Overconfident.
Exactly. You might take on more risk than you can handle. So yeah, emotions are powerful. We've got to be aware of how they're influencing us.
Absolutely. Speaking of influence, what about framing? How information is presented to us?
Oh, framing is huge. Kahneman and Tversky, they did tons of research on this. It basically shows how susceptible we are to, manipulation.
Like how the same information can be presented in different ways to make us see it differently?
Exactly. Think of it like this, a medical treatment. It's described as having a 90% survival rate.
Sounds good to me.
Right. But what if it's described as having a 10% mortality rate? Same treatment, just different words.
Suddenly it sounds much riskier.
Exactly. It's all about what we focus on, the potential gains or potential losses.
So framing can be used to, sway our opinions even when the facts are the same.
All the time. It happens in advertising, politics, everywhere.
It's a good reminder to, think critically about how information is being presented to us. Don't just take things at face value.
Exactly. Question everything. Now, loss aversion, remember that.
Loss aversion, yeah. We talked about it with prospect theory.
Right. But it's so important, it deserves more attention. It's this idea that, well, losses hurt more than gains feel good. Like losing $100 feels way worse than gaining $100 feels good.
It's like that fear of missing out, but in reverse.
Yeah.
Fear of losing what we already have.
Exactly. And it explains a lot about our behavior, like why we hold on to losing stocks for too long or why we're reluctant to negotiate for a raise.
Because we're more afraid of losing what we have than we are excited about potentially gaining something new.
It's powerful stuff. And it can be used against us too, Like imagine you're negotiating a salary increase.
Okay, I'm trying to get a raise.
If you frame it as a potential gain, like I'd like to ask for a raise, you're starting from a position of weakness.
Because the other person sees it as them potentially losing money.
Exactly. But if you frame it as a potential loss, like I'm thinking about exploring other job opportunities, suddenly you have more leverage.
Because now they're worried about losing you.
Exactly. Loss aversion in action.
That's amazing. Okay, this is blowing my mind. What about the endowment effect?
Oh, the endowment effect. This one's classic. It's basically we overvalue things we own just because we own them. Like that old car you've had forever. Objectively, it might not be worth much.
But to me, it's priceless. Sentimental value.
Exactly. Kahneman and Tversky, they did this study with coffee mugs.
Coffee mugs, okay.
They gave one group of students mugs and asked them how much they'd sell them for. Another group, they asked how much they'd pay for the same mug.
And the sellers wanted way more than the buyers were willing to pay.
Way more, even though it was the exact same mug. Just the fact of owning it made them value it more.
So possession is 9/10 of the law, and also apparently value.
Pretty much. And this happens all the time. It can make us hold on to things we should get rid of or overpay for things just because we feel like they're already ours.
Okay, this is getting deep. What about mental accounting? I remember that one being a bit of a head scratch.
Mental accounting, yeah, it's how we organize our finances in our heads. And it can lead to some really weird decisions. It's like we have these separate mental accounts for different categories of spending.
So like fun money is different from bill money, even though it's all from the same bank account.
Exactly. And we treat money in those accounts differently. Imagine you buy a ticket to a show, but then you get sick that day.
Okay, I'm sick, but I paid for the ticket.
Do you still go even though you feel terrible?
Probably, yeah. Don't want to waste the money.
That's mental accounting. You see the cost of the ticket as a sunk cost, something you can't get back.
Yeah.
So you go, even though staying home would be the better choice.
So we end up making decisions that aren't in our best interest, just to stay consistent with these mental categories.
It happens all the time. We might be willing to spend more if it's framed as an investment, even if it's basically the same thing as an expense. It's crazy.
It's like our brains are playing tricks on us with our own money. So we need to be aware of those mental accounts and make sure they're actually helping us, not hurting us.
Absolutely. Okay, let's revisit those two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self, this time in the context of well-being.
Right, because it's not just about making decisions, it's about how we feel about those decisions, right?
Exactly. The experiencing self, that's the one living in the moment, actually feeling the pleasure or the pain. The remembering self, that's the one who looks back and creates the memory of the experience.
And those memories aren't always accurate, are they?
Not always. Kahneman argues that both of these selves contribute to our overall happiness. It's not just about how we feel in the moment, but also how we remember feeling.
So a vacation that was mostly okay but had a couple amazing highlights, we might remember it as being amazing overall.
Exactly. Even if most of it was pretty average, our memories are more sensitive to the peaks and the ends of experiences, not so much the overall duration.
So if I'm planning a trip, I should focus on making sure there are some really amazing moments, even if I can't make the whole thing amazing.
That's the idea. Make it memorable. And this applies to more than just vacations, It's about how we design experiences, how we think about our own lives.
Okay, back to the cold hand study. I remember that one being pretty intense.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how our remembering self can sometimes make choices that are, well, not in our best interest.
Remind me how it worked again.
So people had to submerge their hand in painfully cold water for a while. There were two conditions. One shorter with more intense pain, one longer with less intense pain, but a slightly less painful ending.
And most people chose to repeat the longer one, even though it was more total pain.
Exactly, because their remembering self focused on that less painful ending. It created a less negative memory, even though the actual experience was worse.
So our memories can lead us to choose more pain. That's kind of scary.
It is. It shows how we need to be aware of the biases of our remembering self. Sometimes we need to prioritize the experience, even if it doesn't create the best memory.
Okay, let's talk about how all of this came about. How did Kahneman and Tversky even start researching all this?
They were fascinated by how people make decisions, especially when there's risk involved. They wanted to challenge the traditional economic models, the ones that assume people are always rational, always trying to maximize their gains.
And they did that by, well, asking people questions, right? Setting up these experiments to see how people actually behave.
Exactly. One of their most famous experiments, it involved a gamble. People had to choose between a sure gain of $240 or a 25% chance to gain $1,000 and a 75% chance to gain nothing.
So the sure thing or a riskier option with a potentially bigger payoff.
Right. Most people chose the sure thing, even though the gamble had a higher expected value.
But then they flipped it, right?
Yeah. They did. They presented the same options, but this time framed in terms of losses. A sure loss of $750, or a 75% chance to lose $1,000 and a 25% chance to lose nothing.
So now, the risky option has the potential to avoid any loss.
Exactly. And guess what? Most people chose the risky option, even though it had a lower expected value. Just changing the framing from gains to losses completely reversed their preferences.
So we're more afraid of losing than we are motivated to win.
That's the idea. Loss aversion is powerful. It's why marketing often focuses on what you'll lose if you don't buy something rather than what you'll gain if you do.
Okay, now my mind is really spinning. What about narrow framing?
Narrow framing. It's when we focus on a single decision in isolation without considering the bigger picture.
So like obsessing over whether to buy a new phone without thinking about my overall budget.
Exactly. Kahneman argues that we need to adopt a broad frame to see how each decision fits into our larger goals and values. So yeah, the fun might be nice, but is it worth sacrificing something else that's more important?
This is all about long-term thinking, isn't it? Not just getting caught up in the moment.
Exactly. And that brings us to risk policies.
Risk policies. Like what are those?
Think of them as predetermined rules for how you'll handle risky situations, so you don't have to make emotional decisions in the heat of the moment.
So for investing, I might have a rule about how much risk I'm comfortable with, so I don't panic and sell everything when the market dips.
Exactly. Having those rules in place ahead of time can save you from making big mistakes. And Kahneman emphasizes those rules should be based on rational thinking, not on how you're feeling in the moment.
Because our feelings can be unreliable.
Big time. Okay, let's talk intuition. We all have it, but is it good or bad?
Right. Sometimes it feels like my gut knows best, and sometimes it feels like my gut is leading me astray.
Kahneman makes the distinction between two types of intuition: skilled intuition and naive intuition.
Okay, so skilled intuition is good, naive intuition is bad.
Pretty much. Skilled intuition comes from years of experience and feedback in a specific domain. Think of a chess master. They can see winning moves almost instantly.
It's like they just know. But that knowing comes from practice, not magic.
Exactly. Naive intuition, on the other hand, that's based on heuristics, biases, those mental shortcuts we talked about. It's unreliable.
So, like, my gut feeling about which stock is going to skyrocket, probably naive intuition.
Probably. And it's important to know the difference. We should be wary of naive intuition and try to cultivate skilled intuition in areas that matter to us.
So how do we get better at intuition?
Practice, feedback, and
Yeah.
being in an environment where those things are possible. Kahneman points out that true expertise only develops in areas with stable regularities, where you can get consistent feedback on your performance.
So like chess or surgery.
Exactly. But in fields like economics or politics, it's much harder to become truly expert. There are just too many variables, too much unpredictability.
So even the experts in those fields should be humble.
Absolutely. And that brings us to feedback in general. It's crucial for learning and improvement.
Because without it, we don't know if we're doing well or not, right?
Exactly. And unfortunately, in a lot of areas, feedback is either missing or it's distorted, like with investing. It's hard to know if your success was due to skill or just luck.
So we need to find environments where we can get clear, accurate feedback so we can actually learn and improve.
Absolutely. And then there's debiasing.
Debiasing.
Yeah.
Is that like getting rid of our biases?
Pretty much becoming aware of them and learning to overcome them, like realizing you're susceptible to the availability heuristic, so you start consciously looking for more balanced information.
So it's not about eliminating bias altogether. It's about being aware of it and compensating for it.
Exactly. It's hard work, but it's worth it.
Okay, let's wrap this up with happiness. How does all of this relate to, living a good life?
Well, Kahneman argues that happiness is influenced by both our current experiences and our memories of those experiences.
And those two things aren't always aligned, are they?
Nope. Remember the cold hand study. We often choose experiences that will create a better memory, even if the actual experience isn't as enjoyable.
So we're sacrificing present happiness for future nostalgia.
Sometimes, yeah. Something to be aware of. Kahneman suggests that we should pay more attention to our actual experiences. Try to make choices that will make us happy in the moment.
So savor the good times, minimize the bad times, and don't just focus on how we'll remember them later.
Exactly. And he also emphasizes focusing on the things that truly matter: relationships, health, purpose.
Not just chasing after material possessions or status.
Right, because those things don't actually contribute to long-term happiness.
This is all really powerful stuff. It's about understanding our own minds so we can live better lives.
Exactly. And that's just scratching the surface of what thinking fast and slow has to offer.
We've covered a lot of ground, but as we wrap up, it's worth thinking about, well, how do we actually use all of this?
Right. It's one thing to understand these biases, these mental shortcuts, but how do we apply that knowledge to make better decisions in our own lives?
Exactly. Kahneman and Tversky, they didn't stop with just identifying these biases. They wanted to see how they played out in real-world scenarios, especially when it came to risk and uncertainty.
And they kept challenging those traditional economic models that assume we're all perfectly rational actors always maximizing our gains.
Because we're not, are we?
Not even close. Remember that experiment with the sure gain versus the gamble?
The one where people chose the sure $240 over the chance to win $1,000?
That's the one. Most people went with the sure thing, even though the gamble, statistically, had a higher expected value.
But then, when they framed those same options as losses,
Everything changed. People were suddenly more willing to gamble, even if it meant a higher potential loss.
it all comes back to loss aversion, doesn't it? That fear of losing what we already have. It's so powerful.
Incredibly powerful, and it's something to be aware of in any decision where risk is involved, whether it's investing, negotiating, even just choosing between different options at the grocery store.
Knowing about loss aversion, it's like having a secret weapon. You can anticipate how it might influence your choices and make decisions that are truly in your best interest, not just driven by fear.
Exactly. Okay, let's circle back to those two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self, because they play a big role in how we think about happiness and well-being.
Right, because it's not just about making the right decision. It's about how we feel about those decisions, both in the moment and afterwards.
Exactly. The experiencing self, that's the one in the thick of it, feeling all the joy and pain as it happens. The remembering self, that's the one who shapes the story, the memory we carry with us.
And those memories, they're not always accurate, are they?
Not always. We tend to remember the peaks, the most intense moments, and the endings of experiences more vividly. The remembering self has a lot of power. It shapes how we feel about our past and how we make choices in the future.
So knowing that, what can we do? How do we make sure we're living for the experiencing self and not just for the highlight reel?
It's about being mindful, being present, savoring those good moments as they happen, not just waiting for the next big thing. And it's about accepting that not every experience is going to be perfect, but that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile.
And remembering that our memories are just stories we tell ourselves. We can choose to focus on the good, the meaningful, even in experiences that weren't all sunshine and roses.
Absolutely. And ultimately, it's about focusing on the things that truly matter. The things that bring us joy, connection, purpose, not just the things that look good on Instagram.
Thinking Fast and Slow. It's more than just a book about biases and mental shortcuts. It's a guide to understanding ourselves, our minds, and how to live a more fulfilling life.
Couldn't have said it better myself. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. It'll change the way you think about thinking.
And that's what this deep dive is all about, right? Getting you to think, to question, to explore these fascinating ideas. Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, keep those minds engaged.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.